The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to Manage Storage Capacity and Risk with Defensible Deletion webinar. This webinar will be presented by Jim McGann. Jim is the Vice President of Marketing at Index Engines. Jim has extensive experience with e-discovery and information management in the Fortune 2000 sector. He's a frequent writer and speaker on the topics of big data, backup tape remediation, electronic discovery, and records management. He has written articles for ARMA, ILTA, Forbes, Inside Counsel, and other leading publications. Please type any questions for Jim in the question area on the right of your screen, and he will answer them at the end of the webinar. So let's begin. Jim?
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, everybody, for attending today's session. Today we're going to talk about a topic called defensible deletion. Organizations that we work with know they have way too much data, way too much content created by users that has piled up over the years, and want to be able to manage that content, abide by their current policy and regulations, delete what they don't need to keep, and reclaim a lot of that storage capacity in order to really streamline their data center operations. Again, my name is Jim McGann with Index Engines. If you do have questions, you'll see a chat area or a question area on the right side of your screen. You can type them in during the session, and we'll either take them during the session or take them at the end. Also, you can see my email address on there. Happy for you to send an email directly, and we'll answer it one-on-one. For those of you that don't know Index Engines, we've been in the market since about 2004. We are an enterprise-class information management and archiving platform. Mainly the applications are really compliance and litigation, which is really the proper management and application of policy on your data. But we do a lot of projects around IT and storage, capacity management, and so on. The key components for our technology, which I'll talk about today, is really that we have a capability that can overlay your existing infrastructure and provide detailed knowledge of all data assets. Not only your current data assets, the stuff that users are creating on their desktops or stored on file servers, but the legacy content that goes deep into the infrastructure, legacy data that's on old backup tapes or backup images that were created for disaster recovery. So we have a unique capability there. Also, we have a platform that's designed to integrate very efficiently into the current infrastructure. It's a capability that will index data, allow policy to be executed, and support legal hold, compliance, regulatory preservation requirements, as well as data center consolidation, migration, and so on. Index Engines, again, we launched in 2004. It is patented technology. We have many clients throughout the world and service providers as well that leverage Index Engines technology, mostly to support e-discovery or legal discovery-focused applications. So let's talk about the enterprise data environment. Most of the attendees on this session are very familiar with this environment, obviously. Very complex, large volumes of data, really scattered about the infrastructure. There's a lot of proprietary repositories. I mean, it's not just loose data like presentations and spreadsheets and so on. A lot of it is locked in proprietary repositories, which would be something like email, Microsoft Exchange, Lotus Notes, or backup formats. And backup is an area that is gaining some renewed interest these days just because the IT organizations have been creating backup for years, and its content has been stored in off-site storage vaults that really become presumptive archives. So the fact that data is locked away in those proprietary backup formats is something that records managers and compliance folks are worried about today because it is data that does exist within the corporate environment. The other challenge is everything's saved. I mean, we talk to IT organizations every day, and the constant feedback is that we really don't know what to keep, what not to keep, so we save everything. And their whole premise of the IT organization has been really to make data available, to increase storage capacity, to make sure it's backed up and protected for disaster recovery. So saving everything means making copies of content and preserving it and not purging anything, keeping it forever. We have clients that have 20-year-old electronic files, email, in offsite storage. Users have a lot of power. I mean, users have significant capacity on their desktops. Desktops today are terabyte hard drives. They also have the ability to copy files wherever they want across the network on file servers and network servers and so on. There's really no sense of managing that content. It's unstructured, unmanaged. Email is also a painful environment for a lot of organizations because users can take email and archive it onto their desktop or any kind of network server in PSTs, for example. So taking those PSTs and creating them, users are basically creating mini user-managed archives that are really not, the policy's not applied and they're not controlled, and data can, email can sit in there forever. There's a basic lack of knowledge also across the environment, so it becomes difficult to manage. Clients that contact us really do so for a number of reasons. One, they're developing policy. Two, they don't know what they have. There's a lot of mystery data that exists on their networks, on their servers, and in their legacy backup tapes, contacting us to provide that knowledge of that content to be able to understand what's there so they can make better decisions. So kind of a master directory of that content using the reporting capabilities. So again, in the corporate architecture, if you break it down into 4 silos to simplify the environment, you've got the desktops. Again, users are creating the content there. It's the files and documents that are stored in their hard drives. Email, again, could be archived onto PSTs on their desktops or archived on any server. So it's really where the content is being created. You've got large capacity servers. That's really one of the biggest IT expenses, where IT is continually increasing capacity there, whether it be any kind of flavor of disk-based storage, whether it's dedupe or compressed or optimized. Regardless of the cost, it's constantly being increased in capacity. I mean, we have organizations that have petabytes and petabytes of data, and it's still not enough for what the users are requiring. And users, share and archive data on these servers. It's a pretty dynamic environment. Some of the data is managed on there. If you've got an environment like SharePoint, some of it's not. It's just loose files. But it's a ever-changing environment with significant volumes of data. Obviously, email server, it's really kind of the corporate communication hub. It's really where the home of the most sensitive data lies. Email really represents agreements and contracts and commitments. Other than having an email archive, there's really no easy way to manage the dynamic environment. And even people that we talk to that do have email archives are struggling with being able to manage that content just because they become very bloated and very difficult to find and manage content within the archive. So because of the volumes, because it's just very dynamic and very complex and really a proprietary environment, exchange notes are proprietary, some of the structured databases, becomes difficult to manage. And then finally, you've got backup. I mentioned backup tapes earlier, but all the data that exists in this environment here is constantly moved to backup on a daily basis for most organizations. So all data is copied out for business continuity purposes. In the past, it's been burdensome to get access to and expensive to get access to, but technology such as ours here at Extended makes that data accessible. So the fact that it's burdensome and expensive is kind of out the window. And really what it requires is that content, the backup content, be incorporated into your information governance or records management strategies. And that's one of the obvious areas that we're talking about today in terms of defensible deletion is if you look at the backup data, which is typically aged data that's a couple years old, back to 10 years old or more, most of that has really no business value. So a lot of that can be purged. So defensible deletion is our topic for today. We're going to talk about the concept here. So there's all sorts of different percentages, and I'll show you some of the quotes a little bit later on about defensible deletion, how much data really is required for long-term retention. The basic point is it really depends on the type of business that you're in. If you're a manufacturing organization or pharmaceutical versus financial services. Financial services data has a lot of historical content that's very important that needs to be saved, but more interesting is really the current stuff. So, but we hear numbers anywhere from 40 to 60% or more of user data is not required for long-term retention. So it's the everyday working documents, email correspondence, a lot of spam, a lot of privileged email, a lot of stuff that's that's just really not of interest to the business and has no business value. So the challenge, and this is the biggest bottleneck we see in any organization managing a defensible deletion project, is they don't understand what's there. I mean, how do you classify it? How do you separate the good, the bad from the ugly kind of thing? So that's the key challenge. So using keyword search to find intellectual property and sensitive content, using metadata search to find data on date ranges, owners, locations, this process becomes much more manageable. And we'll talk about that today. So defensible deletion is large volumes of data is really not required for long-term retention. Understanding and separating this stuff to figure out what it is and classifying it is the key strategy. And policy becomes a big issue here. So policy is driven by legal and compliance folks. So what is the policy? So, IT organizations really can't go around and just blindly deleting data. It has to be done within, within the legal guidelines and within policy. So you see a lot of organizations that struggle with, what is our policy and keeping policy up to date because they really have no clue or no understanding of really what the data, what's out there on the networks. So, data mapping, and something we'll talk about later, can help you define these policies, update them, get them really refined and up to speed so you can execute a defensible deletion program that abides by your policy. So the defensible being the key word is really policy-driven deletion. So it's, your ongoing regulatory compliance requirements, active litigation obligations, so you've got, e-discovery requirements and so on that need to be understood here. And then applying the policy, getting what you need to keep into an archive and applying retention periods to that content. So, there's legal hold archives and there's email archives and there's file archives, being able to manage that content properly within those archives. And make sure you apply retention periods. I mean, a lot of organizations that come to us for help in managing their data do have an archive in place, and they've really pushed a lot of their content into this archive and really not applied retention period. So by not applying retention period, that stuff just really sits in there forever, and they just stockpile data in the archive, and then the archive becomes bloated and difficult to use. So, retention periods are your friend there in terms of expiring data out when it's no longer needed. Okay. So here's some of the stats I mentioned earlier. So, a couple of these from Gartner. Actually, all three are from Gartner. No, two are from Gartner. The first one being one of their papers from June of this year, saying that their current estimate on data growth within the enterprise is that it grows 40 to 60% a year. So in terms of storage capacity, that's a lot of money to spend to keep up with that growth. Especially with that, you're adding the storage capacity while there's a lot of data that's really not necessary. It's just like adding an addition to your house because you're a hoarder and the house is completely full and you can't even walk around it. So, the obvious thing is clean up your house versus add an addition to the house. Because you're just going to continue down that path. So, growing data, growth rates of 40 to 60%, which is just astronomical, and it's challenging and expensive to keep up with. Another quote from Gartner from February of this year, talking about that through 2013, the business case for 95% of information management programs will depend on reducing IT costs and managing information risk. So you can't think about reducing IT costs without managing your risk and managing your data, because being that IT is the owner of this data and manages this data, they have to really work hand in hand with the legal organizations to really manage that risk, and in doing so, they'll be recouping significant storage capacity. Finally, the last one that's most interesting is from our friends at IBM. It was a great article about defensible disposal. They call defensible deletion, their term for it is dispensable disposal, or I've also seen defensible disposition, really saying that you can't keep all your data forever, which is the title of the article, which is the Forbes article of July 17th of this past summer. IBM estimates that 69% of information in most organizations has no business, legal, or regulatory value. So that's almost 3/4 of all the data. So the fact that IT organizations are backup and protecting and increasing storage capacity so that 3/4 of their data that's useless could be maintained is really the the message that IBM's getting out there saying, hey guys, you know what, it's time to clean up this stuff, and there's lots of benefits. And the benefits are not only managing the liability of what's hidden in that content, because there is risk there, but also just reclaiming that storage capacity. So in terms of defensible deletion, I mean, if you think about it as an archiving strategy, I mean, you turn defensible deletion on its head and saying, instead of deleting stuff, let's archive what we need to keep, and the stuff that's left over is stuff that we can really delete. So in order to implement the strategy here to archive, which is the important stuff, what you really need is an enterprise index, like an information management layer across all different repositories. So before we saw the desktops, we saw servers, we saw email, we saw legacy backup tapes in a backup offsite vault, storage vault. An enterprise index is really your information management layer that's really lacking in most organizations. So being able to understand what's there, taking the mystery out of that content, understand what exists, so you can execute policy to the data, and data can be managed. So once you create this index, this is the deep knowledge information, who owns what, what's the date, when was it accessed, where is it located, what kind of data is here. You can execute policy to take the appropriate action. And what you'll find in doing so is that in terms of your legal hold preservation or just archiving key business data, you'll find that what's retained in the archive could be a small volume. You're looking at numbers of like 10% of what's on existing networks and so on. So really taking, creating this index to understand what's there, defining and executing your policy, and then taking action on that index in order to hold on to what you need to in an archive is really the flow. So where defensible deletion fits in, it's kind of the opposite of archiving. Archiving is protecting and saving what you need to save. Defensible deletion is obviously purging what you don't need to keep. What we see as a trend out there in the industry is that organizations are really controlling what is saved on the desktop. I mean, instead of giving users terabyte hard drives to store whatever they want, organizations are putting thin clients out there that they can access their data on managed servers and through web-enabled or cloud applications and so on. So really what the desktop is really just a view into their content, not a repository for their content. So more and more organizations are really leading that way of not giving users silos or storage environments to keep stuff. So really controlling what's saved on the desktop, applying policy to data as it ages on the server. So a lot of the data that's on your servers out there, your network servers, is going to remain in place. I mean, keeping data in place is important to support current users in the business, the daily business needs. But as data ages, you'll find it has less and less value to the organization, and you can tell through metadata analysis, what's aging and what has value and so on. So applying that policy to data as it ages allows you to take the content that's on these servers and slowly filter out what's not necessary. Again, I've applied policy to email to purge old email, and again, this is where retention periods are important, because if you have certain email archives that exist out there, their objective was to push as much of that email content or all the email content into the archive so it can be managed. We're saying keep email in place, on the email server and apply policy to it so it can be purged and eliminated from that location. And then the biggest area around defensible deletion we'll talk about is remediating legacy content. So we have clients here in their offsite storage vaults that have tens or hundreds of thousands of legacy tapes, which are really copies of legacy data environments. So defensible deletion applies to that legacy environment as well, and that's really one of the biggest culprits that we see. We have clients that have again 10 or hundreds of thousands of these tapes that are really snapshots and copies of their email and network and user data over the years. So they feel the liability and the risk associated with keeping that content. So remediate that data. So if you control what's on the desktop and you remediate legacy tapes, you're really focused on the middle chunk, which is really the stuff that users are creating today, and keeping that in shape according to your legal policies. So data mapping I mentioned a few times. So that's one of the key components here. And if you do anything after today's presentation is to look at data mapping as a key strategy really to implement across your information assets in order to understand what you have. So data mapping, organizations, again, as I mentioned, have thousands of servers and desktops. It's continually changing dynamic environment, massive volume, very complex to understand. So what we see is the typical business challenges out there that we hear about is that it's very difficult to develop policies. There's no clear understanding of the liability of what exists there. There could be very sensitive manufacturing documents that shouldn't be out there, out there loose in the wild that need to be managed. But there's no clear understanding of what's there and what exists. As users change jobs or leave, the knowledge is lost. The people that manage that data, manage the networks, really have key intellectual knowledge about that content. And as they migrate out or leave, that information's lost. And as data ages, it becomes more and more difficult to find. I mean, I have trouble finding, a 2-year-old spreadsheet on my desktop. You can see, trying to find stuff of 10 years ago or 5 years ago that's kind of out in the network is even more challenging. So data mapping is really an index of user data. So an index that contains rich metadata, rich content that can be used to determine the action or the disposition of the data. So understanding the content and the metadata. So a lot of the data mapping is really specifically about metadata. It can include content, but it's really usually a pretty light pass or a light index across that content to give you a high-level view. So the fact that you can do that across your current data and your legacy content, the stuff that's on backup tape, will allow you to give you a full view into all that information. So once that data is indexed, the ability to summarize and classify it is really at the heart of data mapping. So you can generate the reports, which I'll show you some sample reports of, say, data by owner, by location, by age. You can be able to find sensitive content based on location. So you can zero in on maybe a certain manufacturing division, research and development division, and zero in on their information and say, we're constantly being sued for, product liability, for those kind of issues. We want to, treat that as more sensitive content versus, say, our marketing department, for example. And then develop a playbook. A playbook is really going to be your, the course of action, how you're going to approach this stuff, what to attack first. And I think if you look at the data and profile it, you can say, where's the most sensitive data? Which servers, which organizations, which departments, what type of data, and start cleaning it up. So cleaning up, get your data house in order, clean up your legacy data, implement an ongoing process to manage new data as it's created, because data doesn't just stop being created. You have to make sure that the data map becomes useful from now into the future. And then make sure you use outside counsel, inside counsel, outside counsel. We have clients that use consultants here that would sign off on the process. So the playbook becomes the foundation for defensible deletion, whereas it's going to give you some guidelines on, what happens in certain situations if we have certain types of data, or if we have certain, difficulty. For example, maybe in legacy backup tapes, we have corrupt tape or a tape that can't be read, or we have duplicate data. What is a duplicate file, and so on. So the playbook really goes into that level of detail. Again, having your legal teams and advisors sign off on it really blesses it so that if you do have to go to court or do have to go into any legal situation, they'll stand up by it for it. So indexing the data. So an index, indexing is one of the key components of what we do here at Index Engines. Obviously, it's in our name. But indexing data really allows you to extract really key information about the content. And this is just, you see on the right side, some of the metadata content that's of interest, like when was a file last modified, what email to CC/BCC, when, who owns what data, sizes, locations, and so on. So a lot of that is the valuable information that will be the foundation of data mapping, which is really the key component for defensible deletion. Reports are dynamic, so here in the Index Engines platform, we have full reporting capability to allow you to profile the content. But not only are they built in reports, but they're also very dynamic that you can drill down. For example, if you're looking for a report on a specific custodian or user, say one of your key executives, you can determine where they stored spreadsheets. So maybe your CFO, where are all the spreadsheets owned by the CFO? Obviously, most of them on the desktop or the local file server within that department, but you may find spreadsheets scattered about onto other servers that were unknown and unmanaged. You can also find other users who store spreadsheets on that same server, determine which spreadsheets were accessed in the last 90 days by users and so on. So the thing is you can do iterative analysis of this data to kind of troubleshoot or kind of answer questions about who's accessed what, where it exists, when was it created or modified, and so on. And these reports can be downloaded. So you can see reports by, let's say, access time, file types. What the file type report I'll talk about a little bit later. So you can be looking for emails across the network that you may not know where they exist. You can do reports by host. For example, if there's a server in one of the departments, like research and development, you just want to see who has that data on that server and what kind of data, and so on. So here's an example of user-based mapping. So this is an example from one of our client scenarios where they have, say, a department, let's say a finance department, and they've got 5 users in that department that they're of interest. So that you can import a list of custodians into the interface, generate a report, and say, this is where all the data exists. So if you look at these 5 users, you typically think, there's a departmental server, which could be server X. You typically think that most of their data is on this server. So when you have some kind of investigation or some kind of legal or compliance effort going on, if you said, hey, the finance department, all their data is on server X, we just need to work off server X. But based on the data map, you could do a report of these users, and you can find that, 90% of their data is on server X, but they also have data on server Y. They also have a copy of their data on legacy backup tapes, and they also have data in the email server. So they have copies of content and file emails and attachments to the email server. So, getting a quick profile and saying, our target of any kind of information management or records management process for that department is going to be on the server that resides in that department is wrong. I mean, data typically gets migrated and scattered throughout the organization very quickly. And then you can start profiling the data. So you can say, what type of data does this team own? So going back to this team here, say what type of data they own. What files, emails, databases. What's the age of the data? When was data last modified or created, or even accessed? Show me all the data here on these servers that have been accessed in the past 6 months. You can look at email exchanges, frequency of communication, hidden data. So you can find users here that have created PSTs to store mini email archives, to store them on their desktop is the obvious spot, but also they could be stored on servers and so on. And then shared and duplicate content and so on. So you can use the reporting to profile the files and emails and really get a deeper understanding of that content. So that's a little bit about data mapping back into defensible deletion. So if you look at the, kind of the roadmap that a lot of our customers take when they think about defensible deletion, one of the first things that they really look at is remediating legacy content. So again, that's that content on backup tapes. If you're on the call here and you don't have any of those legacy tapes and you've remediated them all, you're obviously ahead of the game. But a lot of the organizations, 99% of those that we talk to have not yet done anything with those tapes, and they're sitting there kind of just really, in offsite storage vaults, just kind of taking up space and, creating a huge liability and risk, because it really is an archive of your, or snapshot of your user content, files, and emails. So a lot of our customers are focusing in defensible deletion is looking at, remediating that content. Most of our customers have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of these tapes. Again, it's snapshots of all corporate data. IT continues to make tapes and store tapes because they really don't know what to do with them. They can't apply policy to them. It's a very proprietary format. So they keep on throwing them over the fence out to off-site storage vendors to keep for the long term. Again, it's a liability. There's quite a bit of case law that exists out there about fines and sanctions that have been issued for lack of production of data from tape. One of the more famous ones is from about 2 years ago, which is University of Montreal Pension Plan, where in this case it was 13 organizations that were being sued, hedge funds and investors and so on. And 3 of them did not go to court with the data that they were required to bring, or any kind of evidence that the judge had requested, because all that data existed on legacy backup tapes. In that case, for those 3 organizations, the judge issued sanctions and fined them for negligent or grossly negligent lapses in the preservation and collection of responsive electronic documents. And she goes on to say that the failure to identify and preserve sources of potentially responsive evidence, such as relevant backup tapes, is really something that organizations will be fined for from now on. So, I mean, there's judges that are fining organizations for not producing data from tape. So it's hard to ignore. That. So remediating that content. And the funny thing is, when we get involved with these remediation projects for clients, we find that far less than 10%, closer to 1% of what's on those tapes is really something that needs to be retained and archived for the long term. Most of it's really has no value whatsoever. So, but the advantage of doing that is that the return on investment is shocking when you look at it. Organizations are basically taking that expense that they're spending today to store those tapes and reallocating it to remediating that content, and it's really saves them money in the long run. Most of the return on investment of that project is less than a year. So you can see some examples here for some of these projects are, 0.6, 0.7 years to remediate 14,000 tapes, and this is projects that take anywhere from 6 months to 18 months. So it pays for itself basically, and we find that more often than not. So here we talked about the legacy content. Let's talk about email. I mean, the obvious thing to managing email is really applying policy to it, archiving what you need to keep, and make sure that you get rid of what's no longer required. And email archiving is, when done correctly, is a great way to remediate legacy content. But when it's not done properly and there's no retention periods put in the data on the email, it'll just live forever, and users just don't want to get rid of any content. So if you index your active email server environment, allows you to get a view into that content in order to make decisions. So from a legal and compliance point of view, you could have a view into that that environment and determine what user email, what content needs to be preserved, and really proactively applying policy to that content and save email. And typically for compliance and regulatory requirements, you see that about 10% of the user email really needs to be retained for long-term retention. The rest does not. So, by saving 100% of it in the existing archives, which a lot of the archive organizations want you to do, you're saving 90% of too much stuff. And again, you're hoarding email within within that environment. Email archiving allows you to also support requests for legal hold on demand. So you can actually, as you get a legal litigation hold requirement or preservation requirement, you can easily look into that email server platform and select and choose what you need to put on hold. And then you can stop archiving those backup tapes. Remember I talked to you about those legacy tapes that are stockpiled out in offsite storage. The only reason IT organizations are doing that is because they can't apply policy to the tapes and keep what they need to keep and extract it off the tape and just recycle the tape because they don't need to keep everything. So this allows you to stop archiving those tapes because you'll have satisfied that need to put the data on legal hold prior to backup. So the idea is that archiving what you need to do and applying policy, what you need to keep, you're going to keep a small percentage of your email for long term, and the rest could just be purged as part of the natural rotation or aging of email. The other area we were talking about was network servers, applying policy to those network servers as the data ages. So online network data. So use data mapping to define the high-risk servers. Find which ones, like legal, finance, the executive team, and so on, are really the high-risk servers, and you can start focusing on those environments And a lot of, we talk a lot about defensible deletion or data mapping. A lot of organizations can get overwhelmed by the process, but really if you kind of just do a little analysis, understand what exists out there, what kind of content, where's the most sensitive data, you can develop a plan that can start, attacking certain environments, pretty easily, and keep the projects obtainable so you can achieve them in a number of months, measure them, and then add on to it. So here, here's a good example of using data map to look for some high-risk servers. So maybe it's the executive team. You can focus on these servers and maybe apply policies. And a lot of the biggest culprit here on data glut or saving too much stuff is you can focus on, say, files that just haven't been accessed in X plus years. So if you have a policy that says it hasn't been accessed in 5 years or 7 years, you could do things like move it to cheaper storage. So maybe a cloud strategy that your organization has that says, hey, if it hasn't been accessed, move it out to the cloud, leave it there for a bit, a year or two, and if it's not touched any longer, then you can purge it. Files that are owned by ex-employees that have not been accessed for a year. So if it's an ex-employee, then the person that owns it is no longer with the organization. Does that have any interest in remaining, or can that be purged? I don't know. Has it been accessed? Have people been using it? Does it have business value? So you can say, find all the files owned by ex-employees that have not been accessed by 1 year, or 3 years, or 5 years. And if it hasn't been accessed, then really no one knows it's there, and there's really no value to it. So that could be purged. And I think, one of the storage analysts that I was speaking to recently said that based on just finding all ex-employee data could easily save 45% of storage capacity there if you do that. And how much does that represent to your organization by reclaiming almost half your storage capacity? If that can eliminate your storage acquisition budget for 2013, that's a huge benefit. Then applying policy and move intellectual property or files required for regulatory or for long-term retention into the archive, but don't overcollect. I mean, a lot of archives are out there are architected that, we can manage your data. You just have to give everything to us and we'll manage it. We're really a fan of keeping data in place and managing it that way. Kind of based on the index or based on any policy criteria, you can look at the data in place and say, something can trigger an event to say, hey, move it to an archive, or delete it, or encrypt it, or just let it remain. So, as I mentioned earlier, developing a roadmap saying, this is kind of overwhelming for us to implement a defensible deletion strategy. You can just kind of analyze your environments. And this is 4 simple repositories, your desktops, your networks. And you can break networks, obviously, down into many different environments, network environments, email, and legacy tapes. If you look at those 4 buckets, as we were talking about today, you can look at desktops are typically low volume. Although if you're starting to put out terabyte hard drives on these users' desktops, it becomes larger and larger volume, which I don't think you want to do. But it's typically lower scale volume, relatively, and it's medium risk. I mean, the stuff here that they create is less risky than what they send out via email and so on. The network data is high volume. That's where lots of stuff just piles up. And it's pretty low risk. I mean, based on the volume of data, there's nothing there that's really going to, no smoking guns. There can be some, but overall it's pretty low risk. Email server is, again, relatively low volume. You're talking a small number of terabytes here, but incredibly high risk, because that's really where your communications agreements and so on occur. So that's really, if you look at all e-discovery and liability, a lot of it's around email. The thing about legacy tapes is it's high volume because it's really a copy of all this stuff over here. So it's high volume. It's really a replication of all that stuff, a snapshot of everything over the history of time. So it's everything. So it's high volume and it's high risk because it contains all your email in there as well, copies of your email. So you can kind of map out and create a grid of this content and break it down into all your departmental networks, and which includes desktops and email and so on, and kind of start applying these strategies. Is that high risk or not, and determine where to start. And some of the organizations that we work with look at, obviously, legacy tape being at high volume and high risk is one of the top areas where they start to do some cleanup. the next being email. So in a defensible deletion strategy, if you can get your desktops under control, again, if you can kind of control what users can create and not create, but store on there. And a lot of the frequent policy that we see out there is that they're blocking the networks and the environments to allow from users being able to store PSTs, because PSTs become a headache for a lot of legal compliance folks. So stop users from creating that. So, and it brings up an interesting point. We just did a analysis from one of our clients where we took one of their recent full network backups. So it was about 70 tapes. So it was a full backup of their network from last week of all their data. So we indexed that stuff, and they were basically saying, there shouldn't be any PSTs on here because we block access from users to be able to store PSTs. We did a quick report. It within 2 seconds found that there was hundreds of thousands of PSTs on the network that they weren't aware about, or tens of thousands. I wouldn't say hundreds of thousands, but tens of thousands. So you can see, just to audit your policies, the data map has very significant value in that way as well. So if you control what users store on the desktop, you remediate those legacy tapes, you're really well into your defensible deletion strategy. So the playbook I mentioned, and a playbook is a common tool that's used within defensible deletion and data mapping, allows you to really audit and understand what you have. Again, that's the data mapping process. So there's a lot of steps involved in doing these, creating these playbooks. Once you audit, know what you have, you can analyze that, map out sensitive data, update and define your policy, make sure it's sound and it's defensible. Partner with a legal advisor to manage risk and sign off. It's the defensibility angle, and then start deleting and purge what you don't need. Start small, start with the high-risk data, and work your way up. And then archive what you need to archive. So your archive is going to be really the corporate data hub to be able to maintain your data assets in your corporate record, and segregate out what's required for long-term retention. And in the archive, you're seeing anywhere 10, 20, 30% of what exists out there is really what needs to be in the archive. The rest is stuff that can be purged. Okay, so we're pretty much at the end of our 45 minutes or so. So I know here's a quick list of some of Index Engine's clients. We can happy to talk to you about typical scenarios that they're using the product for. A lot of it is about defensible deletion and data mapping. We also do have a white paper. If you do want to copy this paper, it talks about the defensible deletion methodology. It goes into more detail than what I talked about today. I'm happy to send it to you. Just send me an email there. My email address is on the screen, jim.mcgann@indexengines.com, and I will shoot that out to you directly. Somebody asked a question if the PowerPoint slides will be available. I'd be happy to send them to you. Again, if you send me an email to that email address. We're also recording today's session that you could share it with your colleagues or review it with others if you like. And that's about it. So there's a few other questions. Yeah. Okay. A few other questions. Dan, do you have any?
I do have a question. You mentioned a playbook. Do you have a playbook available that defines the process and methodology?
We do have a template that we use. It's not something that we really send out. It really differs every time. So we have an operations team that can work with you to analyze your environment. Say for tape remediation, for example, they basically go through a survey and an interview with you to understand your challenges, your environment, and can come back with some cost and timing estimates as to what these projects take. So a lot of it's based on your environment. I mean, if it's just pure network data, it's a little bit easier. If it's legacy tape data or email, it becomes a little bit more complex. But we don't have one that's basically off the shelf because it's really not one size fits all type environment.
We have one other question, Jim. Why should we touch our tapes? We have not produced data from tapes for any legal purposes.
Yeah, I mean, that's a common question. So, I mean, a lot of organizations have these legacy tapes that they haven't touched in years, and it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. But again, there's a number of organizations, especially financial services, a lot of energy organizations, a lot of the organizations that have been under the regulatory microscope or a lot of litigation against them. really have found that judges have been asking for content and producing content. If it's not on your active email server or networks, to produce it from legacy tapes. So there's a number of legal precedent, and we'd be happy to talk to your legal teams about that show that keeping that stuff on tapes and those tapes are an archive, think about them as an archive, is really a liability. So they just need to be managed. So I think the trend is turning, and organizations are really kind of processing that liability and treating it as a liability. Others are still trying to stick with the burden argument, saying it's expensive and we're not going to touch it, but it's a risky move. Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up. Thank you for your time. Again, if we can provide any further information, feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be happy to get back to you. Thanks again.